Welcome to the instruction manual, and welcome to our new series called How It Was and How It's Changed. This series explores the vast history of education and schooling around the world. We'd also look at areas of inspiration that teachers may want to use in their own classroom. Today's page will cover the story of education and schooling in America. There are many important events that have shaped the American experience of learning and teaching. But before we review the class schedule, be sure to hit the like button and make a comment below if you'd like to see this series covers historical topics of interest that excite and inspire you as a teacher. Alright, now we can look at today's schedule. First, we will learn about the formation of normal schools in Europe and their subsequent adoption in America by Samuel Reed Hall. Next is the evolution of the one-room schoolhouse, the impact of the Industrial Revolution, and then the influence of teacher philosophers Horace Mann and John Dewey. After that, we will cover the impact of women activists in the early 20th century before turning to advancements in education in relation to civil rights and the intervention of the U.S. federal government. Finally, this page will make comparisons between the past and the present state of U.S. education. That's quite a bit to cover, so let's turn to the next page and get started. When you see headlines about public education today, it's easy to come away discouraged. You may feel like education has decreased in quality rather than gain improvement. Quite the contrary. If you go back to the country's first attempts at providing free public education, then a simple comparison will show you how far we've come in providing quality schooling. Before we move on, you'll see that we have put post-it notes at the corner of your screen. This is a practice we adopt to model delivery of historical content or any topic that uses heavy exposition or uses important dates, places, and names. We hope this is a practice you might use for your own online lessons. U.S. education descended from the Rhine region of France. In the late 17th century, John Baptist de La Salle was a practicing priest within a local parish. La Salle founded a series of schools that taught young boys from lower-class families. The boys were taught scripture and manual trade skills. Most importantly, La Salle's schools were the first to provide lessons without cost to the families. Schooling in Europe and the U.S. was predominantly provided on an individual basis by paid tutors. Education was a luxury given to male children whose families could afford to pay for lessons. But La Salle was one of the first in Europe to introduce a classroom structure where one teacher, or in this case a local priest, would teach to multiple children simultaneously. This method became so popular that many novice teachers and priests came to La Salle for the opportunity to observe his methods. La Salle then wrote The Conduct of Schools in response to what became the adoption of the École Normale, or the normal school. The normal school was not just a classroom for children, it was also the first training center for teaching. Novice teachers would observe veteran instructors in one room and then practice teaching methods in another separate room. These practice rooms of laboratory classrooms would become fundamental in creating teacher training centers that are used today. La Salle's normal school was a boon to the growing population of a young America. By 1642, the colony of Massachusetts had already written laws that required every household member, including servants, be taught to read and write. And by 1647, Massachusetts also set into law that male children would have the training needed to attend the newly formed Harvard College. But education was still mainly utilized by elite students and families until the early 19th century. That is until the Industrial Revolution shattered class barriers that blocked lower-class access to education. Before, aristocratic families needed education to forward the business of running estates and government institutions. Now it was business leaders and factory owners who felt the need to prepare incoming workers for tasks that required basic schooling. So in 1823, a minister from Concord, Vermont named Samuel Reed Hall founded America's first normal school. Hall introduced a similar method of embedding teacher training into the lesson curriculum taught to children. Hall believed it was important for teachers to use display media during lessons in classes, and that trained teachers should be paid a living wage. Despite the adoption of normal schools, many states in America put few resources and even less funding into the provision of public education. In farming communities, schools were mainly employed during the winter months, after harvesting, and before planting seasons. The classic one-room schoolhouse was left mostly abandoned during spring through fall when adults and children alike worked the same hours to support their families. Schoolhouses were notably placed in churches or on non-arable land, and were not inspected for safety. A local farmer or paid laborer would be hired by the town to teach in the one-room schoolhouse. His job was normally a paid holdover between farming seasons or other jobs. This practice of using off-season laborers likely spawned the phrase, "those that can't do, teach." Since teaching was a job taken up when other paid work was unavailable, these teachers would only need to know basic literacy and math to helm a classroom. The students were not separated by age or grade. The lessons were not a structured curriculum, but mainly relied on memorization and rote teaching methods as primary instruction. This would be the standard, nationwide practice of teaching for the next century. Even now, you can see a stark difference between the classrooms of 1885 and 2025. And throughout the turn of the century, education reforms that we benefit from today were slow, but seminal in creating our modern schools. Once again, Massachusetts led the way in evolving widespread access to public education. In 1837, the first state board of education was founded within the state, and its first secretary was Horace Mann. Mann had been part of a movement in which he advocated for more state control over public schooling. It had been tough to get local schools to guarantee that the appropriate amount of funding and resources would be used to create better learning environments and higher wages for teachers. Mann and the Board of Education were the result of that movement, allowing the state to determine education outcomes and provide reforms through funding. Horace Mann continued to lobby for state control of schools and to allow students of all religions, social and ethnic backgrounds to attend. Under his watch, Massachusetts was the first to provide trained teachers for public education settings and the first to develop schools or teacher training for primary education. All schoolhouses were free to attend, and any town in Massachusetts with over 500 residents had to include a free high school education to all of its students. By 1852, school attendance was compulsory, and Massachusetts was the first again to put this into law. New York followed suit shortly after, and then eventually all states in the Union required mandatory schooling, but public education for women and people of color was still far from accessible. In 1896, the Supreme Court established the precedent of separate but equal education within the Plessy v. Ferguson verdict, and most secondary public schooling was only made predominantly offered to boys. While the Industrial Revolution eroded class barriers to schooling, most classroom learning aimed at creating uniform workers. Farmers and lower-class children were groomed to perform low-pay, manual work. Children in urban schools were taught to perform math and reading needed for factory labor. Also in 1896, a philosopher named John Dewey launched the elementary school in Chicago. He used this school as a way to revive La Salle's normal school environment. Dewey's own lab schools promoted active learning. He did away with having students perform passively during lessons. He also reduced the use of textbook material and rote performance that was meant to be absorbed by students without critical thinking. Dewey believed in active training, manual learning, and creating cooperative environments, rather than competitive classrooms with rote desks, harsh discipline, and lectures. His students gardened, cooked, made shoes and clothing, and tutored their younger peers. As Dewey's ideas began to pervade into schoolhouses, the teacher population of America had changed dramatically. 90% of American teachers were now female. This slow but dramatic increase of women teaching in classrooms remained steady well beyond World War II. When women gained voting rights in 1919, they began exercising reforms to achieve better working conditions for teachers. Women like Grace Strachan and Margaret Haley advocated for equal pay and pressured states to do away with entrance tests that promoted gender discrimination and bias. Haley also triumphed by seeing that local corporations were taxed as a means to secure funds for local schools. These were small victories in the face of ongoing and new challenges to American education. Rural schools were still only allotted one room for growing student populations, and in cities, underpaid teachers faced an influx of immigrant families with children from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. American public education had been guaranteed to the common man and had opened doors to women entering the workforce, but it needed stabilization and state governments that were willing to provide schools with funds and resources. Progress eventually came through the introduction of civil reforms. In 1946, the National Free Lunch Act was passed to provide free meals to low-income students, and in 1954, the Supreme Court overturned the separate but equal precedent when the Brown v. Board verdict set the standard for schools to be desegregated. 1974 saw the Equal Education Opportunity Act. This congressional act granted equal school access to all races, genders, and ethnic backgrounds. This was the first time that women and people of color could attend any school in the country. These political reforms were the first steps towards having the U.S. federal government become increasingly involved in how schools managed education quality and how they provided equal access to education. The Cold War saw schools receive increased federal support for math and science programs. The federal Head Start program gave support to impoverished families with children younger than 5. Now, public education stood at an impasse as more and more schools opened across the country. The one-room schoolhouse had become a thing of the past. School buildings took on the look that we all still recognize. Long corridors with many classrooms lined on either side. Each schoolroom was now helmed by trained teachers with either high school degrees or training experience within a practicum classroom. But many still felt that classrooms still mirrored the setup of a typical factory floor. Dewey's Lab School was only one of many that offered curriculums for states and districts that sought an alternative to factory-first learning. Many schools would experiment with open room designs and would adopt European curriculums like the Montessori method or Reggio Emilia. The American Montessori Society was founded in 1960 and Reggio Emilia started to gain traction in the early 90s. The first charter school in the country opened in 1992 in St. Paul, Minnesota. As American schools expanded and diversified, the later decades of the 20th century brought on a great push by state and federal governments to create a more unified education for all. Federal funding and federal laws began to aim American education toward a globalized standard of schooling. We may think that standardized tests are a recent occurrence, but school-wide assessments have been adopted and used as far back as 1845. As governments became more invested in student outcomes, schools saw the implementation of academic standards and laws helmed by U.S. presidents who continually attempted to create a uniform teaching curriculum throughout the country. Presidential reform movements helmed legislative acts like No Child Left Behind by George W. Bush, Race to the Top by the Obama administration, and Common Core that was spearheaded by Microsoft mogul Bill Gates. All of these were meant to adopt an equal adherence to state learning standards and to improve state and national assessment scores. Now, 2 decades into the 21st century, it would serve us all to take a look back at the massive evolution of American schooling. Today, 60% of large school districts have learning content that is formatted for online access. Since 2020, online curriculums have prevailed within classrooms across the country. There are now systems in place for students with learning disabilities, school counselors, athletics programs, and many more resources that would have never seen the light of day over 100 years ago. Schools now offer access to scholarship and grant opportunities for college. There are also systems in place for students with food or housing insecurities. Now, think of your own classroom. Think of the students you teach compared to the average student lucky enough to access a school way back in 1896. Think of your own training background as a professional compared to the part-time farmers of the 1830s. It's absolutely true that teachers still face struggles with wage reform, with resource access, and with political instability. But when you look back, it's hard to deny that American public education trends mostly toward improvement. And with that trend, it's likely to only get better from here. Comment below to see even more pages about the history of education in America or the history of education in other countries. And don't forget to subscribe and join our Patreon for access to incredible resources that you can use in your own classroom. Until next time, we'll see you on the next page.